free downloads. Let's see how does this work. So here's an outline of the talk today and some key messages that I hope to bring to you. First, there's record numbers of pink salmon returning in recent years with a database going back at least to 1925. And I hope to show that a lot of this increase is related to humans. Next, I'll describe this pink salmon, which is very important because they provide a natural experimental control to test for competition in the ocean. It's a competition at sea is a controversial issue, as you might imagine, because the hatcheries are producing more and more salmon released into the ocean. And so it's important to try to tease out those effects on whether or not they're competing for food, affecting their growth and survival. Next, I'll provide evidence for a trophic cascade in the North Pacific and Bering Sea. And that's where pink salmon crop down zooplankton, and in turn, that has an influence on phytoplankton. Then I'll show you a bunch of evidence that we have for pink salmon competition with marine species, especially other salmon species. And then lastly, the last third or so of the talk, I'll talk about this new paper, as well as the old paper that we published back in 2019 on how we think pink salmon are influencing southern resident killer whales and Puget Sound, Salish Sea, Chinook salmon. So this chart shows the abundance trend of Pacific salmon from 1925 to present. People should be surprised to know that there's now over 1 billion salmon returning from the North Pacific Ocean. That's hard to imagine when you're living here in the Pacific Northwest, where there's relatively few salmon coming back, except for maybe this year, with all the pinks coming back. But about 80% of those salmon coming back from the North Pacific, and I'm talking about both North America and Asia, 80% are pink salmon in recent years. As the chart shows, the pink line is pink salmon. In recent years, close to 900 million pink salmon have returned. It's also important to recognize that there's a biennial pattern of pink salmon abundance. I don't know if you can see that. Yeah. And that's part of the experimental control that I'm talking about. Pink salmon have a fixed 2-year life cycle. They spawn in fresh water, the fry go to sea right away. They spend only 1 winter in the ocean and then come back to spawn. And so the even and odd year lines are genetically distinct, and that sets up very distinct differences in abundance, typically throughout their range. Odd year pinks, adults coming back in odd years, are about 1.6 times more abundant than even years. It's also worth noting that hatchery production has increased over the years, and back in 2018, Jim Irvine and I, a Canadian scientist, estimated that roughly about 40% of the biomass of adult and immature salmon in the ocean are hatchery origin. So here's some evidence for the impact of humans on pink salmon. With data going back to 1955 through 2021, pink salmon abundance returning from the North Pacific Ocean is highly correlated with the ocean heat content estimated by NOAA Fisheries, is shown here in this graph. The trend is consistent for both odd year line and even year line pinks. But at the same time, over the past number of decades, hatchery pink salmon production has increased from roughly 400 million back in the 1970s to almost 1.4 billion in recent years. In fact, in Alaska, which when I started working up there, there was almost 0 hatchery fish, but now 43% of the hatchery salmon caught, or the pink salmon caught in Alaska, are hatchery origin. And then lastly, pink salmon escapement throughout North America is increased about 5-fold since the 1950s and 70s to more recent years. And this is partly because pink salmon are actually underutilized, underharvested in regions like our own, like in the Fraser River. They're not able to harvest all the pinks because of concern for the bycatch of Chinook and some other depleted salmon. So I'm not going to talk too much about hatchery-wild interactions, but I think it's important to show this graph from the state of Alaska. I was surprised to make these calculations a couple of years ago to learn that Alaska is now the world leader in hatchery production. They release about 1.9 billion hatchery salmon each year. They're now surpassed both Japan and Russia in terms of the number of hatchery fish released, and about 1 billion of those are pink salmon. This plot, the hatchery releases are shown here by this black line. These are all species combined, pinks, chum, and others. But the bar chart here shows in the red bars is the number of hatchery salmon caught in the Gulf of Alaska region of Alaska. So it excludes the Bering Sea, which is pretty much all wild salmon. So it's just the Gulf of Alaska region of Alaska. The blue bars is the harvest of wild origin salmon in the Gulf of Alaska region to compare. But the blue bars exclude the wild pinks, which are very robust. So if you look at the ratios here, in recent years, in the Gulf of Alaska region, in wild, pristine Alaska, 5 hatchery salmon are harvested for each wild salmon during these recent years. Chum salmon in this region, about 80% are hatchery origin. For pinks, it's about 43%. So when looking at competition between these species in the ocean, it's important to recognize that these salmon migrate thousands of miles or kilometers in the ocean. Many of the Chinook salmon, for example, in our region migrate north and have the potential to compete with pink salmon and other species of salmon in the north. This graph shows the extent of Russian or Asian pink salmon into the North Pacific and Bering Sea is shown by the blue line here. Pinks migrating this far east are primarily from eastern Kamchatka, which is an extremely abundant population of wild pink salmon. And they're primarily the stock that's competing with, for example, Bristol Bay. The red line here shows the western extent of North American pink salmon, but keep in mind that there's actually very few pink salmon originating from Western Alaska, the Bristol Bay region. So most of these pinks are stemming from the Gulf of Alaska region of Alaska, including Kodiak. Okay, so this is a chart from a paper published by Larson et al. Back in 2013, including Jim and Lisa Sieb. It's based on genetic stock identification of Chinook salmon sampled in these different regions, primarily along this region from the pollock fishery. But I use this just to show that salmon from the Pacific Northwest, the lower United States, are migrating up here. For example, in this region here, can you see it? Yeah. About 11 to 38% of the Chinook caught here originated from the lower United States. If you included southern British Columbia, then the number jumps up to 29 to 71%. When you move farther west, then you lose some of the Chinook salmon from the Northwest here, and it's dominated by Alaska salmon, which makes sense. Way down here in the Aleutian Island region, about 67% of the Chinook were from Alaska. So this is just to highlight that the Chinook are migrating long distances, and so they're interacting with pink salmon from both Alaska and Russia. This is a chart from a recent paper by Canadian scientists dealing with the International Year of the Salmon. was quite interesting, I thought. A wintertime survey found British Columbia, Fraser River sockeye salmon way out here, way out west, potentially interacting with pink salmon, not during the wintertime. That you can ask me about that later. The pinks tend to be south of sockeye in the winter, but they compete in the springtime. But the important thing, these sockeye are in their first winter. They just left the Fraser River, for example, it included a choco sockeye based on the genetics information, just, I don't know, 6, 8 months earlier, 9 months earlier. And here's a plot from one of the talks that Kate Myers gave a few years back. Kate, is a world expert on salmon distribution at sea and wrote a chapter on steelhead throughout the North Pacific. But the point here, these are tagged, codewire tagged steelhead from the lower 48. They're migrating way out there. Steelhead are probably the long distance migrators among all the different salmon, because they only spend, these fish are probably mostly 2-winter steelhead. So this is a chart just to show you, give you an idea of what I'm going to present and how we use pink salmon as a tool to test for competition at sea. As I mentioned, pink salmon are highly abundant in odd-numbered years compared to even-numbered years, and that's what's shown. Yeah, it's showing. Is shown here. This is actually Eastern Kamchatka pink salmon relative abundance. That's where I'm comparing abundance in a given year with the average from the previous and year following that. So it really highlights this biennial pattern that you see here. The black bars are odd-numbered years. The white bars are even-numbered years. This is the population that dominates the Bering Sea region. And then when you look at, so we search for these patterns in other species of salmon, such as sockeye, and this is just scale growth. Scales are just like tree rings, an index of growth, salmon growth during each year, or actually each season in the ocean. And here you can see how pink salmon, or the scale growth of sockeye salmon, varies on a alternating year basis. And then the other approach we often use is to simply correlate the growth, in this case, or survival, with pink salmon abundance. So the first topic that I want to talk about here is the evidence that pink salmon actually cause or initiate a trophic cascade in the North Pacific and the Bering Sea. And this evidence for this actually stemmed from Japanese scientists, multiple papers before we published this study based on the continuous plankton recorder here. But with the plankton recorder, we were able to collect continuous plankton data from year 2000 through 2014. And this data set has been collected and organized by Sonia Batten, who's up in British Columbia. Basically, the plankton recorder is towed behind commercial ships, as shown here. And here's the track that they used for the data that we published a few years ago. So this is what I mean about a trophic cascade. Up here on the top is the abundance of pink salmon returning to Eastern Kamchatka, which is the dominant species of pink salmon in that region of the Bering Sea. As you can see, in odd-numbered years, the black bars here, pink salmon abundance is very high. In low, or in even-numbered years, it's relatively low. And then immediately below this chart here in the middle is the estimated density of large copepods collected by the continuous plankton recorder. And what was really neat about this is that we could see this biennial pattern in copepod abundance. It was just the opposite of that of the pink salmon that were migrating through this area. And then just down below that, we also had densities of large diatoms. And again, they showed a biennial pattern that was positively correlated with the pink salmon, but negatively correlated with the zooplankton that are feeding on them. But what was also interesting about this time series is there was another experiment taking place. In 2013, the Russian abundance of pink salmon, eastern Kamchatka, unexpectedly collapsed. It's shown right here in 2013. Normally these odd year abundances are very high. And in response, the zooplankton abundance bumped way up, especially for an odd year situation, giving more evidence that there is a cause and effect here. And then diatom abundance was relatively low. We also did simple correlation analysis, and you can see that zooplankton abundance or densities are negatively correlated with pink salmon, and diatom abundances are positively correlated. Okay, next I want to talk about competition between sockeye salmon and pink salmon. We probably have the most evidence for this interaction than any other species. This shows the general overlap of Bristol Bay sockeye salmon and Kamchatka, eastern Kamchatka pink salmon, shown here. It's probably broader than this. This is based on coded wire tag, or not coded wire tag data, but high seas tagging data that Kate Myers had pulled together over many years, primarily in the 1950s and 60s. Based on genetic analyses, we know that this area of overlap is greater than it's shown here. But sockeye and pinks have the greatest diet overlap among all the different species of salmon. And this is just to give an example of sockeye and pink diets, the blue, light blue here being zooplankton, the darker blue is fish, and then the red are squid, eaten by both sockeye and pinks. These are maturing pinks. This is a data set collected by Nancy Davis, who used to work here at the University of Washington for many years, along with Kate Myers in the high seas salmon program. This is probably one of the best data sets of salmon diet that we have for the North Pacific Ocean, because she collected it on these Japanese research ships over a 10-year time period, in the summer, of course. But what's cool about this is that it shows there's a lot of diet overlap between these two species, but it also shows that in these odd years, when pinks are highly abundant, the stomach contents of the sockeye decline 38%. In fact, the highly valuable high energy species, the fish and squid, declined 57% in sockeye in these odd numbered years. By comparison, pink stomach contents also decline, but not nearly as much as the sockeye. So pinks are highly efficient foragers out there, and that's why they grow so fast. So another line of evidence for sockeye is that we've digitized, we've measured tens of thousands of sockeye salmon scales for Bristol Bay in this case. This Egegik, Ugashik, Queechak, Naknek, Wood, all the major systems in Bristol Bay. And this shows the relative scale growth, in this case, in the third year in the ocean. The same pattern is shown for the second year in the ocean, but basically showing in odd numbered years, when there's lots of pink salmon out there, scale growth is low, consistently low throughout this time period from 1960s through, in this case, nearly 2010, 2009, I think it is. In the first year at sea, there's relatively few pink salmon in the Bristol Bay region, and there's no biennial pattern seen in the scale growth. This sockeye salmon scale growth, again, in the third year at sea is negatively correlated with Eastern Kamchatka pink salmon. Each dot here is the mean of many hundreds of sockeye scales because we have so much data. Over here to the right is smolt to adult survival information for Bristol Bay sockeye that migrated as age 1 smolts and age 2 smolts. And what you see is that when the sockeye in Bristol Bay migrate in an even numbered year, and then they begin to compete in the following year, the second year, which is the odd year, they experience a significantly reduced survival. This program, by the way, I think it's still was terminated a long time ago. I don't think they've ever recovered or started to estimate smolt abundance again. That chart down here in the lower right, now we're looking at the adult returns of Bristol Bay sockeye from a given smolt migration year, even versus odd year smolt migrations. And what we see, again, consistent with the survival data, when the juveniles migrate in even numbered years and compete with the pink salmon in the following odd year, they have reduced adult abundance, as shown in this plot here. In fact, over this time period, forget how many years, there's 85 million fewer Bristol Bay sockeye coming back in that from those even year migrants, excluding the Quechak, which is complicated because of the cycle. And then over here in the lower left, it's interesting to show that there's actually forecast error shown in relation to pink salmon. This is the forecast error that goes back to 1968, and it's ADF&G's. To be consistent, I used ADF&G's forecast to look at the error. And it basically shows that there's generally a biennial pattern that's related to pink salmon. It's interesting to note that Daniel Schindler and some of his colleagues, including Curry Cunningham, recently published a paper a couple of months ago where they're now incorporating pink salmon into the in-season Bristol Bay forecast. Last year, the Canadian scientists with Department of Fisheries and Oceans published a paper in which they are also incorporating pink salmon into the Fraser River forecast. So we also looked at scale growth of sockeye salmon in the Gulf of Alaska region. Igigik, of course, is Bristol Bay, but all these other populations are from the Gulf of Alaska region. Here's Black Lake, Chinook Lake, where I worked many years. This is a stock that's severely depressed in recent years. But here's the Kenai River, Cog Hill. Here's the famous Copper River. What you see in all of these plots is a negative correlation in their growth, in this case, the third year at sea, and the abundance of pink salmon that they would be competing with. The line is obviously the mean regressed value. Each one of these dots, just to show you, is an individual fish. So there's a lot of variability, but you can see this consistent pattern. Then up here in the upper left is the mean relative sockeye growth of all of these different populations, just to show you that consistently there's a depressed growth during odd numbers at sea when there's lots of pinks. So moving farther down south with sockeye salmon, in 2015, Brendan Connors and I published this paper looking at primarily Fraser River sockeye salmon, but also some stocks going up into Southeast Alaska, and this pink line here points out Lake Washington. What you see is the productivity or survival of these sockeye salmon, and this is a data set that goes from 1978 through 2005, on average was depressed when they interacted with pink salmon in odd numbered years. It's shown by these red, negative, or downward pointing graphs or arrows. Consistent with that, if you look at the length of age at these sockeye salmon, you also see that in odd numbered years when they're competing with pinks. Growth, adult length at age is reduced. The last slide here on Bristol Bay sockeye, here we're actually looking at probably 90% of the sockeye returning to North America. 47 sockeye populations from the Bering Sea region of Alaska, the Gulf of Alaska region, and then southeast in British Columbia here. This is for brood years, parent spawning years, 1976 to 2009. And what we find is strong evidence for competition with pink salmon. For example, British Columbia and Southeast sockeye salmon have a 21% reduction in their survival when competing with an increase of 119 million pink salmon, or one standard deviation increased in pink salmon. What was interesting about this model, statistical model, is that we also looked at sea surface temperature, but the competition had a 2 times greater effect on British Columbia, Southeast Alaska sockeye than did sea surface temperature. So here's the blue, the light blue is largely Bristol Bay sockeye. They experienced about a 9% reduction, but that's largely masked by a very positive effect the sea surface temperature has had on Bristol Bay sockeye salmon, as shown over here. Next, talk about coho salmon. Coho salmon love to eat squid. In the Gulf of Alaska region, one estimate was about 90% of their diet is squid, largely Veriteuthis, anaki, salmon squid here, shown, there it is. Coho salmon only spend typically one winter in the ocean. And so if you look at this chart, this goes back to 1970, you'll see an up-down pattern, again, a biennial pattern that reflects pink salmon. So in odd-numbered years, the growth or the size of these coho salmon returning to Southeast Alaska is low, and in even-numbered years, it's high. Now, these squid are eating pinks, or sorry, these coho are eating squid, but pinks in this region are also eating squid. And some of the estimates by, for example, Japanese scientists sampling the Gulf of Alaska region, they found that 40 to 80% of this, the pink diet was made up of these squid, and primarily the Veriteuthis squid is shown here. The model that Leon Scholl and Heil Geiger developed here and published in 2016, which we updated in 2023, explains about 68% of the variability in coho. You can see this tremendous decline in coho weight over time from the 1980s to present. Over here on the far right shows the partial effect of pink salmon on coho weight, a sharp decline. The model also incorporated a PDO, which had a positive effect on coho weight. I should mention that there's also evidence for a pink salmon effect on Kuskokwim River, Western Alaska. Coho, a very large population of coho salmon that experienced a 33% fewer harvests of coho in odd-numbered years. Steelhead, there's more and more evidence now for steelhead being impacted by pink salmon. Megan Atchison, a student here, I think Tom was on our committee along with Kate Myers, a long time ago found pinks and steelhead sharing a diet in the high seas. The graph over here shows a negative correlation between the survival of Thompson River steelhead in the Fraser, interior Fraser River, very strong negative correlation. The Keogh River is on the northeast side of Vancouver Island, a winter run steelhead, again, a negative correlation in smolt to adult survival in relation to pink salmon. And then in the Columbia River, the B run, which is monitored there at Bonneville Dam, showed this very distinct biennial pattern of abundance that was just the opposite of pink salmon up in the North Pacific. Since we published this information in 2023, there have been 3 other publications I'm circling here, looking at Columbia River steelhead in relation to pink salmon, as well as the Washington coast steelhead survival that was affected by pink salmon. So pink salmon also affects forage fishes. I'll just briefly mention a couple of them here. This is a study published by NOAA fisheries scientist, Matt et al., 2020. The black line here shows otolith-based growth of Atka mackerel in the Aleutian Island region. The pink line is Eastern Kamchatka pink salmon abundance. You can see that they're just varying inversely. When pink salmon abundance is high, Atka mackerel growth, they're feeding on zooplankton, is low. The plot down below here is, again, the same black line as growth of the Atka mackerel in relation to the zooplankton in that region, highly correlated. But again, as I mentioned earlier from the trophic cascade paper, the pinks are impacting the zooplankton abundance here. So this is kind of a new finding that we have evidence that pink salmon are affecting the growth of herring. This is Sitka Sound herring. I don't have the years here. Over the past several decades of data. But what we found is that there's age-specific growth of herring was lower, or it shows a very strong biennial pattern for each age group of herring, as shown here. The herring growth, change in growth was negatively correlated with pink salmon abundance returning to Prince William Sound, Southeast Alaska, and British Columbia. So a couple of the colleagues that I work with quite a bit on the pink salmon work, Alan Springer is retired from the University of Alaska, and Gus Van Vliet, both bird experts. They've published a couple of papers on the effects of pink salmon on seabirds. This is just one example showing this biennial pattern in the Aleutian Island, Bering Sea region, basically showing that there's late breeding of these seabirds in odd-numbered years when pinks are highly abundant. These seabirds are often feeding on the same prey as pink salmon. They also published this really cool study here where shearwaters are breeding down in the southern hemisphere off of Australia, Tasmania, but they migrate in their winter, they migrate north to feed up in the North Pacific Aleutian Island region. And these guys documented a negative effect of pink salmon on those birds that are making this tremendous migration. Okay, now I'd like to switch over to Chinook salmon. We have quite a bit of evidence for the interactions on pink salmon on Chinook. Part of it I'll show you here. But this is important because Chinook salmon abundance and size is declining everywhere, throughout Alaska and Russia. No doubt there's important effects on Chinook in fresh water, but such a large range of impacts suggests that something's going on in the ocean. We think pink salmon is just one of those effects. So this top chart here shows in blue the harvest, commercial harvest of Chinook salmon in Alaska and British Columbia. It reached a peak here in the 1980s and then a steady decline. In fact, over this time period, there's been an 80% decline in Chinook salmon harvests. You know, obviously, there's a lot of factors affecting the harvest of Chinook salmon. So this is just an interesting trend shown here. But here is the corresponding abundance of pink salmon over time. This is a running average of 4 years of pink salmon, corresponding to when those Chinook would have been interacting with them in the ocean. The plot just down below that shows in blue now is the weight, the average weight of Chinook salmon caught in these fisheries. Again, they peaked here in the 1980s, and then a steady plummet in the average weight due to a change in the age, as well as weight at age. Overall, there's been a 40% decline in the weight of these Chinook salmon. So it raises this question, to what extent might pink salmon be impacting Chinook? On average, it's worth noting that there's roughly about 500 pink salmon returning from the ocean per Chinook salmon. So a lot of people think that pinks are planktivores and they do not compete with Chinook salmon. In fact, if you look at stable isotope ratios, you'll see that Chinook, coho salmon, steelhead are at a higher trophic level than pink salmon. The problem is those stable isotope ratios don't reflect the switch in the diet that pinks undergo in the North Pacific Ocean within a couple of months of them returning to spawn. During that late time period, when pinks reach about 1 kilo or larger, they switch over and they're eating more and more fish and squid, the same prey that these Chinook and coho and steelhead and sockeye are all feeding on. Everybody likes to feed on fish and squid when they can. So this, going back to Nancy Davis's tremendous data set of diet in the Bering Sea, here's the diet of Chinook salmon in even-numbered years. You can see they're targeting squid and fish to a large extent, but look at what happens in odd-numbered years when all these Eastern Kamchatka pink salmon are out there. There's a 56% decline in the stomach content weight of Chinook salmon in odd years. And there's a 68% reduction in squid and fish in the stomachs of Chinook salmon in odd-numbered years. This is over a 10-year time period. So 5 years of sampling in odd years, 5 years of sampling in even years. This is important because these Chinook that are longer lived need high energy content prey, such as fish and squid, especially when ocean temperatures are rising. Larger fish are more impacted by the high temperatures in terms of converting prey to body energy and fat. So the fact that they're losing a large percentage of their squid and fish in these warming waters is probably a significant factor, I think, in their decline. By contrast, again, as I showed you for the sockeye chart, pink salmon have a somewhat reduced prey in their stomachs in odd-numbered years, but not nearly as much as Chinook. And you can also see that the pink salmon are eating quite a bit of fish and squid, as shown by the dark blue and the red. So this is a graph that Leon Schall and Hal Geiger, two scientists now long retired from Alaska Department of Fish and Game, put together a very similar type model as the coho model that they developed. Again, using pink salmon and the PDO to explain, in this case, about 75% of the annual length variability in Chinook length caught off of Southeast Alaska. You can see from 1982 through 2018 or so, it's kind of a steady decline in the weight or the length of these ocean age 4 Chinook salmon. And the red dashed line here is the model prediction, just showing that it's a good fit of the model, which explains about 75% of the variability. This was a surprise when we started looking, writing this paper in 2023, the synthesis. We took a look at the Japanese high sea salmon fishery. That was a big part of the research effort at the University of Washington for many decades, which Colin Harris, when I was here, Colin Harris, Kate Myers, Nancy Davis, Trey Walker worked on, as well as Don Rogers. It was a big deal because the Japanese were out here harvesting targeting, for example, Bristol Bay sockeye in the high seas, and the effort of the United States and Canada is to try to push them farther west so they wouldn't intercept sockeye and Chinook salmon. So they're using gill nets largely, for example, to target sockeye, but they also caught Chinook. So I looked at the catch data from 1955 through 1981, and what I found was that the Japanese high seas fishery caught 39% fewer Chinook in odd numbered years than even years. They were catching look at the numbers here, 254,000 Chinook per year in odd years, but 417,000 Chinook in even years. That's a huge number. When you look at the number of Chinook salmon that are harvested now, well, they closed the fishery. And for example, the Yukon River, a huge Chinook river, it's now closed. Hardly any Chinook being caught. It's just mind-boggling how many they were catching. But the important thing here is that it was a biennial pattern. Here's the relative Chinook catch from 1955 through 1980. In these odd years, consistently lower, fewer Chinook being caught, indicating there's something going on here in relation to pinks. And here's a negative correlation between Chinook catch and pink salmon catch. Scale pattern analysis work by Kate and the group in the high seas team here at the UW. They found that the large majority of these Chinook caught in this region were headed back to Western Alaska and Central Alaska. What this means in terms of present day, because everybody's very much aware of the decline in Chinook throughout the state of Alaska, but the decline is actually more than what we see in most of the data that people are looking at. And that's because if these fish were not harvested out in the high seas, the decline would have been even sharper. I should mention that they're using gill nets, and the gill nets were targeting about 85% of the catch were ocean age 2 Chinook. And that's partly why you can see a biennial pattern, because they were not using variable mesh nets in the commercial fishery. This is a study that looked at the annual growth at sea of Chinook salmon migrating from hatcheries stemming from the Columbia River, Washington, and Oregon from 1978 through 2013. And they looked at growth in relation to a lot of oceanographic variables, the PDO, Aleutian low, MPGO, El Nino bifurcation. What I found what was interesting, they also looked at pink salmon, and North American pinks had the greatest negative effect on the growth of these Chinook salmon populations from 1978 through 2013. Okay. So in 2005, Fred Getz and I analyzed, over 50 million code wire tagged Chinook salmon and looked for alternating year patterns of survival. And these are sub-yearling Chinook released from 13 hatcheries as shown here. This includes Puget Sound hatcheries, and there's several hatcheries up in British Columbia near the Fraser River. What we found is that from 1984 through 1997, there was a biennial pattern in survival. On average, 59% reduction in survival when they entered the Salish Sea in even-numbered years and potentially competed with numerous juvenile pink salmon that were produced by the odd-year parents. Later on, we analyzed scale growth of Skagit River Chinook salmon. It took us a long time to analyze this because one of our previous presidents canceled the Global Change Program for the USGS. And so we lost 3 out of 4 years of funding about 15 years ago. But anyways, I managed to analyze the data, and what we found is that these young of the year or the early marine growth of Chinook salmon returning to the Skagit River was lower in these even years, suggesting that there's a food reduction influencing the reduced survival. Okay, lastly, I want to talk about the effect of pink salmon and whether or not they're impacting the southern resident killer whales. And today, the journal formatted version of this publication just came out. So it's available. At the end, I'll show you a link if you're interested. There's 50 free downloads that people can receive, or just contact me and I'll send you a copy. It's supposed to be open access, but we're having trouble getting money up to Canada to pay for the open access. But it's important to recognize that, okay, killer whales, these southern resident killer whales, rarely, almost never eat pink salmon. Even though the pink salmon are swimming right in front of their noses, and from late July through August, early September, pink salmon are abundant in the Salish Sea. At the same time, when there's a lot of Chinook salmon also migrating through this region that the killer whales are targeting. So just another little story. Colleagues and I, Alan Springer, Leon Schall, Gus Van Vliet, and I were, I don't know, the killer whales were in the news back in 2017, 18, and we're looking at the Center for Whale Research website. And we noticed that this is shown here in this chart. There's this up-down biennial pattern in mortality of the killer whales. It just, to us, it just stood out. So I contacted Mike Ford and Eric Ward at NOAA Fisheries. Both of them work with salmon and the killer whales, and asked them, have you noticed this pattern? And they said, no. So I called Ken Balcom, who collected all these killer whale data since the very beginning. And I had a great conversation with him for, at least an hour, learned a lot from him, and he had never seen this pattern either. So anyways, we published this because there's something going on here. And we suggested at this time that it may be just simply that the high numbers of pink salmon, which are about 50 times more abundant than the Chinook during this time period, may be interfering with the echolocation of the pinks. I still think that's a possibility, but we have some new information I'm going to show you with in a minute. This is another way of looking at the mortality of these killer whales, just to highlight this very unusual biennial pattern. In this case, the mortality, and actually mortality of the births as well, the young whales that were born, is higher in even years, not odd years. But there's a paper published by John Ford, one of Canada's top killer whale scientists, who estimated there's about a 1-year lag between reduction in food and mortality, which makes total sense for these huge animals. They're just not going to die right away when they have a bad feeding season. But what this data shows is that from 1998 through 2017, there's about 3.6 times more deaths in even years compared to odd years, when right at the same time that the population was declining from about 92 to 76 whales. At the same time, successful births were 56 or 50% lower. So back when we did that study, I assumed that the diversity and age at maturation of Chinook would probably mask any kind of an odd even biennial pattern in adults Chinook coming back to the Puget Sound. I was wrong. And that's what I want to talk about here is in this new paper. Over the years, I've been working with colleagues there at the Snohomish County PUD who collect very detailed information on pink salmon and Chinook salmon spawning in the Salton River, which is right here, a tributary to the Skykomish and the Snohomish River Basin. And very distinct pattern taking place. So first I'll talk to you about what's going on in the Salton River, and then we expanded that to look at for a biennial pattern in the abundance of Chinook returning to Puget Sound. These are the natural origin Chinook, fish spawning in the rivers. So here's the data for the Salton River. Kilometers or so of the river, which is lower gradient. The river upstream of this area is a canyon area. It's a higher gradient. And pink salmon return in huge numbers, hundreds of thousands of fish, about 300,000 in 1 year, in odd numbered years. But they mostly spawn in that lower river, the lower gradient area. And Chinook salmon spawn throughout the entire river. But in those odd years, what this data show is that in odd numbered years, a lot fewer of them spawn in the lower river where there are pink salmon. They migrate upstream to get away from the pink salmon. And the people walking the streams and floating the river, they observe reds or a pink salmon digging up the Chinook salmon reds, for example, in the lower river. So there's a very distinct biennial pattern in the spawning distribution of these Chinook. But they also found is that the Chinook fry produced per Chinook salmon red, was significantly lower in odd numbered years, parents spawning in odd numbered years when they shift upriver compared to even numbered years. We also found, which I'll get into here, that for the entire Salton River, there are 44% fewer Chinook salmon spawning in odd numbered years. There was about, on average, about 500 Chinook spawn per year. Oh, and this is a note here to me that this is a topic that I think is very important to the Atlantic salmon situation, where pinks are invading those rivers. People that I've spoken with over there, they told me that when odd years, when pinks enter the rivers, pinks are now more abundant than the Atlantic salmon. They chase the Chinook salmon, or not the Chinook, the Atlantic salmon upriver, and they snorkel survey for Atlantic salmon abundance, and they see the pink salmon are aggressively attacking Atlantic salmon. So looking at the rest of Puget Sound, the number of spawners, so 7 Pacific Salmon Commission indicator populations, which represent about 75% of total Chinook spawners, the natural origin fish, in the Puget Sound region. This is from 1975 through 2022. And what we see is not much of a biennial pattern in this early time period, but beginning around 1997, all of a sudden, there's a sharp biennial pattern of the number of Chinook making it back to the spawning grounds. This same pattern is observed when you look at the total run size of each one of these 7 populations. In a given year, there's like 60% fewer Chinook salmon spawning in odd numbered years compared to the previous and post even numbered years. We also found that Chinook salmon abundance in these populations has been declining over the years, but it's declining faster for those odd year spawners, as shown here. And then overall, Chinook salmon abundance has declined with increasing Chinook or Puget Sound pink salmon spawners. Here in this plot, we're looking at the individual populations that are shown up here. For example, Nooksack, Skagit River fish, Stillaguamish Chinook, Snohomish, Salton River, and the Green River. During 1975 to 1996, on the left side, there's no pattern. But in the more recent years, 1997 to 2002, we see a very distinct biennial pattern, which was reflected in the graph that I showed before. For each one of these populations, there's a reduction in number of spawners. And this corresponds to a time period when pink salmon escapement is tripling in the Puget Sound region because of conservation concerns. A lot was happening right around 1997, 1998. That's when Chinook salmon were listed. Harvest rates declined. They're trying to protect Chinook. pink salmon escapements increasing. There's a major 1997-98 El Nino. Selective fishing, marked selective fishing began. So there's all kinds of changes taking place. But very clearly, there's a decline in odd year spawning Chinook and odd year run size. So we also looked at the productivity of the Chinook salmon in these same watersheds. And again, for the early time period, there's no pattern. But in the more recent pattern, 1997 to 2018, the return per spawner, these are residuals from the Ricker curve, there's a significant reduction in the survival of these Chinook salmon, is shown here, compared to even-yeared fish that are producing or spawning in even-numbered years. Now, this is facilitated again by the dominance of 4-year-old Chinook salmon in the Puget Sound region. Unfortunately, we don't have a real good age composition for Chinook salmon in the Puget Sound, so that's why we simply used the number of Chinook returning 4 years later. But what this implies, so productivity from these odd year spawners is lower, but also there's fewer Chinook spawning in this time period. So this is an indication of the compensatory mortality. This is really important because it means that the population's stuck down here. Normally, density dependence is incredibly important to the recovery of salmon and any fish that's commercially harvested. I mean, it goes back to Ricker's classic 1954 paper. Basically, the reason you can have commercial fisheries is that when you harvest those fish, the productivity of the much smaller population increases. But in this case, when you have compensatory mortality like this, just the opposite is happening. So it's trapping the abundance at a lower level. So this is, I think, a really important subject that the agencies need to take a look at. So now getting into the killer whale update. So this is just a slide update that we published in 2023 related to the southern resident killer whales. Again, showing that in odd-numbered years, there's a high, actually in even-numbered years, there's a large mortality of population change in the southern resident killer whales, again, related to the 1-year lag time period. But there was also another paper published by Stewart et al. In 2021 using drones to measure the body condition of these these killer whales. And for the L pod, which is the largest pod of the killer whales and the one that's declined the most, there's a very distinct biennial pattern in their body condition. In odd-numbered years, in September, you know, after pink salmon are passing through the region, there's a significant reduction in the body condition of each one of these age groups of the L pod. There's also some evidence that the K pod was affected as well, but not nearly as strong as with the L pod. This is interesting because in that same paper, they found that the L pod, which showed these biennial patterns, was mostly correlated, their body condition was mostly correlated with Puget Sound Chinook salmon abundance and not the Fraser River Chinook salmon population, which has a much bigger population of Chinook salmon. So the J pod was not biennial, according to these body estimates. And they found that the J pod was correlated primarily with Fraser River Chinook abundance and not the Puget Sound. So very interesting patterns here. The K pod which showed some evidence of a biennial pattern, tended to be more linked to Puget Sound Chinook abundance than any of the other populations that they looked at up and down the coast. So this is the last slide, just showing the overall summary of these effects. So what we see is that from the 1975 to 1996 time period, pink salmon abundance, especially the escapement of pink salmon from in the Salish Sea and Puget Sound has increased dramatically, tripling in Puget Sound region as shown up here. At the same time, there's been about a 40% decline in the abundance of Chinook salmon returning in odd numbered years. And that, we think, has had an influence on the high mortality of southern resident killer whales in even numbered years. If this is true, and I think it is, then there's some simple management actions that can take place. Pink salmon are not being harvested to the extent that they potentially could, and I don't advocate for eradicating pinks by any means. These are primarily wild origin pink salmon, but they could be potentially selectively harvested as long as we can figure out a method to minimize the mortality on other stocks of salmon that are depleted. And then also some of these Chinook salmon are migrating far north to Alaska, into the Gulf of Alaska, even into the southeastern Bering Sea. And Alaska is producing massive numbers of hatchery fish, including pinks, and they're probably competing with some of the northbound Chinook salmon. So that concludes my talk. Here's some papers that largely summarize what we've shown here, and or links here to the most recent paper that just came out today. So thanks.
Take a question or two before we repair to the snacks. Yeah, go.
There was a really fascinating talk, and it seems like there's kind of an almost overwhelming amount of evidence as to the impact of pinks at all kind of trophic levels. So I'm curious why you think managers aren't already really ramping down hatchery production.
The hatchery production?
Yeah, but why?
Well, we're dealing with Alaska. In short, they're just, you know, they very much like their pink salmon in their hatchery production. The hatcheries in Alaska are private nonprofit hatcheries. And, you know, they provide some local benefit to those local fisheries like Prince William Sound, but there's a trade-off and there's a decline in the wild pinks in that region. But it gets subsidized by hatchery production. It's a problem. They look at our research here and they think that the ocean is a black box. There's just so much, they want more direct evidence. And I think they don't fully understand all of the evidence we had. I've only shown you a part of the evidence. And since we came out with the 2023 synthesis, for example, the steelhead, there's 3 new steelhead papers. There's multiple new papers on sockeye interactions. I think there's another paper related to Chinook salmon as well. So more and more evidence. But people are reluctant to hold on to their hatchery production.
Yeah, Mary? Is it Mary?
Yeah. I was curious about, it seems like, you know, we get a break every other year from pink salmon. And I was wondering if the hatchery production tends to damp that effect, whether because of, you know, they're putting out a set number maybe every year. Does that happen at all?
There is some dampening, of course, but I'll refer back to a paper we published 2022. In fact, might have it. Here's the chart. Typically pinks are abundant in odd numbered years. In 2018, a record number of pinks at that time came back in 2018, an even year, largely Russian pinks. And that was followed by a very huge run in 2019. So we had back-to-back years of exceptionally high pink salmon in the North Pacific Ocean. In 2020, the abundance of all 5 species of salmon collapsed 2020 was the smallest harvest, the lowest harvest of Chinook salmon on record going back to 1925. Here are the numbers. There was a 54% decline in Chinook salmon relative to the previous 10 years, which had already been declining, 42% decline in chum, 40% decline in pinks, 27% decline in coho. The one species that did well was sockeye in Bristol Bay, and that's for a different reason. But if you look at sockeye in the Gulf of Alaska region, there was a 44% decline. So we're back-to-back years of high pink abundance. And we think combination of that plus some of these marine heat waves led to a tremendous decline in the commercial harvest of salmon throughout everywhere. Now in 2024, last year, Alaska experienced a sharp reduction in pink salmon. I suspect that was an even year. It's probably related to the record abundance of pinks in 2023.
Okay, Greg's got a little bit of a cold. I'm gonna suggest we give his voice a break and repair outside. I'm hoping that someone has taken care of refreshments. Thanks again, Greg.